In Persepolis, the capital of ancient Persia, a scene unfolds in a temple. The air is filled with the fragrance of burning frankincense. In the center stands a sacred fire on an altar, flames dancing, casting flickering light on the polished stone reliefs, while a circle of robed priests chant hymns in an ancient tongue. At the front, the King of Kings himself raises his hand towards the fire, calling upon Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, to bless his empire. In that moment, fire and faith unite the gathering. The flame symbolizes truth and divine light, embodying the god's presence among them. This was, perhaps, a scene that could have taken place during the height of the Achaemenid or Sasanian Empire. It was often hailed as the golden ages of Zoroastrianism. And so with the scene set, I welcome you to a journey through time, back to the 6th century BCE, and all the way forward to the 7th century CE, when Zoroastrianism was not a religion practiced by a small minority as it is today, but simply the beating heart of two of history's greatest empires. Prepare to hear stories of emperors and priests, battles and rituals, tolerance and zeal. We'll explore how an ancient faith guided kings and shaped laws, how its principles of truth and righteousness became a moral compass for mighty emperors, and how its sacred fires burned in the temples of Mesopotamia to Central Asia. We will begin with a brief refresher on the origins of the faith, for those who have not watched the first video, Who is Zarathustra, which I will link for those interested, and his revolutionary message. And then we will delve into the Achaemenid Empire and the Sasanian Empire, the two grand dynasties under which Zoroastrianism thrived and reached unparalleled influences. We'll also hear words from outsiders too, Greek historians, baffled and impressed by Persian customs, a people who refused to defile water or fire, and thought telling a lie was the worst sin of all. We'll walk through the corridors of time to the Sasanian era and see those powerful high priests who could make and break kings, and when libraries of Zoroastrianism's scriptures were compiled for the ages, some, or most, lost to time. Through archaeological evidence, primary texts, and even legends passed down, I'll try to illuminate this golden age of Zoroastrianism. So, close your eyes, think of that eternal flame, and let's step back into the ancient world. But first, let me welcome you. If you want to learn everything there is to know about Zoroastrianism, or anything else about history, you're in the right place. You're on the right channel at the right time. So, for those who have not done so yet, hit the subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from down below in the comments. And with that in mind, let's get nice and relaxed and begin. As mentioned, we will begin with a brief refresher on Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, and we will then go on to a more chronological historical approach. If you have already watched the first video on this and want to skip this section, refer to the timestamps. So our story begins long before the rise of imperial Persia. It begins with Zarathustra's Pitama, known to the Greeks as Zoroaster, a priest-prophet who likely lived sometime between 1500 and 1000 BC on the steppes of Central Asia or northeast Iran. The exact date and place are shrouded in mystery and legend, of course. Later tradition even fancifully claimed he lived 6,000 years before Plato, which is frankly ridiculous, but what does matter is the message that he proclaimed. According to Zoroastrian tradition, he received a divine vision around the age of 30. In that vision, he beheld Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom, who revealed to him a profound truth, that Ahura Mazda is the singular, supreme God, creator of all things that are good. Of course, this was a bold departure from the polytheistic traditions of Iranian religion at the time, worshipping many gods, the Devas and the Asatas, and involved rituals not unlike those of Vedic Indians. Zarathustra preached that life is a moral battlefield between Asha, truth and order, and Druj, lies and chaos. On one side stands Ahura Mazda, the source of all goodness and truth, opposed by the evil spirit Angra Mainyu, also called Ahriman, who embodies darkness and falsehood. The good guy and the bad guy. Every human being thus had their role in this cosmic struggle by exercising their free will to choose good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, the triple moral precept of Zoroastrian ethics. In fact, good thoughts, good words, good deeds, Humata, Hukta, and Farshta, became the creed by which Zoroastrians sought to live. It's a pretty easy one to remember, too. Not too complicated. The key teachings of the prophet will be quickly summarized as follows. First, we have monotheism and dualism, that a single benevolent God, Ahura Mazda, was worthy of worship, in perpetual conflict with the evil force of Angra Mainyu. Humans must side with good against evil. Then we have Asha versus Druj, the truth versus the lie, the world operating on Asha, divine truth and order. To lie or commit injustice is to support Druj, which means that you're effectively aiding the evil spirit. Telling a lie was the most disgraceful act in Persian culture. Number 3, we have moral responsibility. This is the idea that humans are not passive. Each person's ethical choices contribute to the triumph of good, or the triumph of evil. Thus, virtue is a duty, from honesty and charity, to respect for the natural elements. And then we have sacred elements too. Fire, as a pure creation of Ahura Mazda, and water and earth must be kept free of pollution. Fire, in particular, became a symbol of divine light and truth, and it was kept burning continuously in temples as a sign of the eternal presence of Ahura Mazda's wisdom. Well, of course, initially Zarathustra's message was met with resistance and criticism. Imagine walking from village to village, challenging the priests who worshipped the old gods and performed blood sacrifices. But the breakthrough became when he found a powerful patron. According to later Zoroastrian tradition, Zarathustra won the support of a local king, Vishtaspa, by debating opponents and even performing miracles. The story tells that he cured the king's favorite horse. Of course, there was the deal. He would only cure him if the king would become one of his new followers, and then the king's wife and sons and all of the old priests and sorcerers would be thrown out. In fact, he wanted them executed. Whether or not that happened, well, I'm not sure if that's feeding Angra Mainyu or not. But either way, by the cusp of the 6th century BCE, Zoroastrianism, or Mazdayasna, the worship of Mazda, had taken root among the Iranian tribes. No, hold on, it wasn't the only religion. Many variations and local cults surely persisted. It's extremely hard to keep track of them, but its ethos was becoming influential, and set the stage for what happened next. A Persian tribe from the region called Pars, led by a dynasty claiming descent from an ancestor named Achaemenes, rises to conquer the known world. They carry with them their cultural values and beliefs. And as we move into the era of the Achaemenid Empire, keep in mind those core Zoroastrian ideals of truth, moral choice, and the sacredness of elements. They might shine through in how these emperors justified their rule and administered their diverse empires. The Achaemenid Empire. Zoroastrian ideals in the First Persian Empire, from 6th to the 4th century BCE. The Achaemenid Empire, from 550 to 330, was the first of the great Persian empires, and under rulers like Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes, it became the largest empire that the world had yet seen. During this period, Zoroastrianism may not have been a formal state religion, at least in the way that we think of it in later times, but Zoroastrian beliefs deeply informed the royal ideology and practices. The Achaemenid kings saw themselves as chosen by Ahura Mazda, and strove, at least in ideal, to rule by the principles of justice, Asha, and to suppress the falsehood of Druj. So let's explore how all this played out, historically and politically. And what better place to start with Cyrus the Great in the seeds of a golden age. So Cyrus II, reigning from 559 to 530 BC, is famed for founding the Achaemenid Empire by uniting the Persians and Medes in conquering lands from Asia Minor to Babylon. Cyrus's reign is often associated with tolerance and enlightened rule, hence the name Great. While direct evidence of Cyrus's personal religious beliefs is pretty scant, later tradition and indirect clues suggest that he honored the Zoroastrian god. Cyrus's legacy of tolerance, allowing captive peoples like the Jews to return home and rebuild their temples, fits in pretty well with Zoroastrian ethics of respecting truth and justice for all peoples. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay charter buried under Babylon's walls, has Cyrus declaring that he restored some temples and repatriated displaced peoples, though it credits the Babylonian god Marduk for Cyrus's victory, which is pretty understandable, since it was addressed to a Babylonian audience. Cyrus's actions of mercy could be seen as influenced by a Persian worldview that despised oppression and lies. Indeed, the Greek historian Xenophon later depicted Cyrus as an ideal, just monarch in his work Chiropaedia, reflecting how even outsiders imagined Persian kingship in moral terms. An anecdote often told is that when Cyrus entered Babylon in 539 BC, he did so peacefully, and was thus welcomed as a liberator. We might envision a Magus, a Zoroastrian priest, standing beside Cyrus as he pays respect to the city's chief deity, showing a bit of benevolence. That ought to make him look good in front of the crowds. In fact, Cyrus understood that to rule an empire of many nations, tolerance was strength. This attitude resonates with the Zoroastrian concept of Asha, which included the idea of arta, justice in royal conduct. By not forcing the Persian religion on others, Cyrus was perhaps following the tenet that religion should convince by righteousness, not by compulsion. If Cyrus planted the seeds, it was Darius I, or Darius the Great, 522 to 486, who explicitly linked kingship with the Zoroastrian faith. Early in his reign, Darius faced a kind of a crisis, a series of rebellions across his empire and a challenge to his throne by a usurper. According to Darius' own inscriptions, a mage priest named Gaumata had falsely taken his throne by impersonating Bardia, also called Smerdis, one of Cyrus's sons. Darius asserts that Gaumata, the Magian, lied, saying, "I am Smerdis, son of Cyrus," and seized power until Darius and the loyal Persians killed the impostor. This event, often called the false Smerdis episode, has a striking religious undertone. The pretender is labeled a liar, a deceiver, essentially an agent of Druj, an agent of Angra Mainyu. While to cement his legitimacy and recount his early struggles, Darius commissioned a monumental trilingual inscription, carved high on a cliff face at Beistun in western Iran. In this bare stone inscription, Darius proclaims his lineage and right to rule, and crucially, he attributes his success to Ahura Mazda. Listen to him in his own words. This is from the carved stone, still in 520 BC. By the grace of Ahura Mazda am I king. Ahura Mazda has granted me the kingdom. Well, you can't argue with that, can't you? He continues to emphasize that it was Mazda's aid that helped him defeat his enemies and brought the rebels to justice. Toward the conclusion of the inscription, Darius makes a moral statement that sounds kind of like a Zoroastrian sermon. It goes like this. As to these provinces which revolted, lies made them revolt. But then Ahura Mazda delivered them into my hand, and I did unto them according to my will. He urges future kings to punish the liars and uphold truth, so that the country will be secure. Through Darius' testimony, we see an emperor consciously casting himself as a champion of Asha. He literally credits truth and Ahura Mazda for his victories and blames the rebellions on lies. This alignment of royal duty with the cosmic battle of truth versus falsehood is a pretty stunning hallmark of Zoroastrian influence. In essence, Darius used religion to legitimize his rule. He was a king because the supreme god chose him to be the king, and because he stood on the side of justice and truth, quelling the chaos. But Darius did not stop at proclamations. He organized an empire with a strong emphasis on law and justice. Records show he standardized laws and coinage and facilitated communication, i.e., the royal road and the postal system, all of which can be seen as attempts to impose cosmic order on the earthly realm, mirroring the role of Ahura Mazda's truth, bringing order to the world. While these administrative feats have practical reasons, it's fascinating to consider that Darius may have seen good governance as simply part of his religious duty. But how did outsiders view this? Especially the Greeks. While the Persian kings left important clues, some of our understanding of Zoroastrian practice has to come from outsiders, especially in Achaemenid times. Herodotus, the Greek historian writing in the 5th century BC, gives a famous account of Persian customs, and indirectly perhaps their religious practices. Though not a Persian himself, Herodotus interviewed people who had traveled or lived in the empire, and his generally respectful description seems to corroborate many Zoroastrian features. So according to Herodotus, the Persians, I quote, have no images of the gods, nor temples, nor altars, and consider the use of them a sign of folly. Their wont is to ascend the summits of the loftiest mountains, and there to offer sacrifices to Zeus, which is the name they give to the whole circle of the firmament. Now, you heard the word Zeus, right? Well, by Zeus, Herodotus means the Persians' highest god, clearly Ahura Mazda, whom he interprets as a sky god. This description matches the aniconic, that is, no idol worship in Zoroastrianism. Rather than statues, the Persians worshipped in nature, under the open sky. Fire altars on hilltops or mountain shrines were their equivalent of temples. Herodotus even notes that later on, the Persians adopted the worship of an additional deity, Urania, whom he equates with a goddess the Persians called Mitra. Here is likely referencing Mithra, the Zoroastrian Yazata of covenant and light, showing that by his time Persians honored Mithra and a goddess of fertility, Anaita, alongside Mazda, an only syncretism within the Zoroastrian framework. But Herodotus, see, I'm merging Zoroaster and Herodotus together there, aren't I? Herodotus. Herodotus, rather, also describes Persian sacrifice. He describes it like this: "They raise no altar, light no fire, pour no libations. There is no sound of the flute. But the man who wishes to sacrifice brings the victim to a pure spot of ground and calls upon the name of God." This absence of altars and fire in sacrifices might seem a little bit odd, given that Zoroastrians do use fire in ritual, but likely Herodotus means that they did not use altars separate from a natural setting, nor did they make bloody sacrifices on flaming pyres like the Greeks did. Instead, a magus is required to be present and chant hymns during the sacrifice. Herodotus says again, "It is not lawful to offer sacrifice unless there is a magus present." It shows the importance of the magi, the hereditary priestly class, who were by then the guardians of the religious rites. They chanted prayers, probably verses of the Avesta or similar, during ceremonies. Herodotus makes other fascinating observations, aligning with Zoroastrian norms. He says that the Persians celebrate their birthdays lavishly, and that they value truth above all. He says, the most disgraceful thing in the world, they think, is to tell a lie, and that even owing debt is bad because the debtor is obliged to tell lies. This reverence for truth-telling is exactly what we expect from followers of a religion exalting the truth. He also notes that they do not urinate or wash in rivers to avoid polluting water which they sacredly regarded. And actually, quite intriguingly, he mentions the funerary practice. Persians, or at least the Magi, exposed dead bodies to be torn by birds or dogs before burial. And this is a clear reference to the Zoroastrian practice of sky burial. They believed a dead body is nasu or unclean, and must not taint earth or fire. So naturally, it's left out to the scavengers. A bit of a horrific sight, I suppose, for modern sensibilities, but that's just the way they did it. I suppose those who were out there having their sky burials probably didn't have much to say about it. To add to Herodotus, another geographer, Strabo, in the 1st century BC, noted that in Cappadocia, that is Anatolia, where many Persians had settled, there were fire temples called Piratheia, that is fire houses with altars of eternal flame, and magi tending them, who wore tall hats covering their mouths so as not to pollute the fire with breath. Strabo says that these magi would sing incantations before the fire every day, holding a bundle of sacred twigs. He also observes that Persians made sacrifices by striking the animal instead of cutting, to avoid spilling blood on fire or earth directly, and that whenever Persians wanted to sacrifice to any god, they first prayed to fire. All these accounts paint a pretty consistent picture of Zoroastrianism worship in the Achaemenid period. It is aniconic, it is fire-centered, purity-conscious, truth-oriented. The Greeks, accustomed to their statues and temples, found the Persian approach noteworthy, and perhaps in some ways admirably austere. From Darius onward, Achaemenid kings regularly emphasized their relationships with the god Ahura Mazda. Many royal inscriptions often begin with phrases such as, "Xerxes, the king, says, by the favor of Ahura Mazda I built this," or something along the lines of, "May Ahura Mazda protect me in my kingdom." For instance, at Persepolis, Xerxes I, that is Darius' son, by the way, left inscriptions on his building projects, such as, "Xerxes the great king says, what has been built by me here, all that by the favor of Ahura Mazda I built. Me may Ahura Mazda together with the gods protect, and my kingdom." Notice, together with the gods. The Achaemenids acknowledged the other good deities too, like Mithra and Anahita as helpers of Ahura Mazda. reflecting an inclusive henotheism rather than a strict monotheism. A significant religious declaration by Xerxes appears in what scholars call the Daiva inscription. Xerxes recounts that when he became king, there were certain regions in his realm where people formerly worshipped the demons, devas. Xerxes claims, "Afterwards, by the favor of Ahura Mazda, I destroyed that place of the devas, and I proclaimed, the devas shall not be worshipped any longer." Now, this is pretty remarkable, don't you think? It sounds like an official act of religious reform, or even suppressions of cults deemed to be demonic. The term Daiva, in Zoroastrian context, refers to the false gods or demons, the very entities that Zoroaster denounced. So, Xerxes is basically saying that he uprooted demon worship somewhere in his empire. We're not entirely sure what the event this corresponds to historically. Some people think it may refer to Xerxes suppressing a rebellion in Babylon, or perhaps quelling unrest in Egypt. But Xerxes framed it in any case on spiritual terms. He portrays himself not just as a king, but as a defender of the true faith, stamping out the worship of false deities in favor of Ahura Mazda. So from this we gather that by the 5th century BCE, Persian kings were confident enough to enforce a sort of centralization of religious policy, at least in some cases. It was likely pragmatic. Rebellions often coalesced around local temples and priesthoods, but the language used, well, it shows the Zoroastrian mindset. Good things destroy the cult of demons. Yet, we should note that the Achaemenids generally remained tolerant of a myriad of religions within their vast domain. They are known to have patronized or allowed the gods of the Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, and others. Darius and Xerxes themselves funded the restoration of temples in Egypt for Egyptian gods, for example. How to reconcile that with Zoroastrian beliefs? Well, the likely answer is that Achaemenid policy distinguished between loyalty to the empire and personal beliefs. You see, as long as subject peoples paid tribute and didn't cause any trouble, the kings were content to let them honor their own gods. The empire was simply just too huge and diverse to impose one religion everywhere. It was just not going to work. The kings and their Persian core, however, maintained their devotion to Mazda and the Zoroastrian ethos. It's kind of like the royal family considered Ahura Mazda the universal god, hence their mission to uphold truth everywhere, while recognizing other gods as either local manifestations or perhaps minor beings. One late Achaemenid king took an interesting religious turn. Artaxerxes II, reigning 404 to 359 BCE, explicitly invoked not only Ahura Mazda, but also Mithra and Anahita in his inscriptions. In fact, Artaxerxes II encouraged the cult of Anahita, the goddess of waters, fertility, and wisdom, and reportedly had statues of her erected in various cities. And this is curious because earlier Persians, as Herodotus said, shunned idols. Artaxerxes' introduction of statuary for a deity might represent a kind of syncretic shift, possibly under influence from conquered peoples or a loosening of strict iconoclasm. It could also hint at Zoroastrianism or other subsects developing by that time. In any case, the mainstream remained very loyal to Ahura Mazda, Mithra, and Anahita as a divine triad, and Artaxerxes II's reign shows how Zoroastrianism was flexible enough to adapt and incorporate new elements, while still maintaining the core. So, during this golden age, as we are going to call it, under the Achaemenids, how might an ordinary Persian experience Zoroastrianism? You see, we talked about kings and inscriptions and all that. It's only natural. That's the sources that we have. But what about daily life and culture? What was that like? Well, we'll do our best, as usual. Every Persian family was expected to tend a household hearth fire, keeping it clean, keeping it alive, a microcosm of the eternal fires. They likely prayed at dawn, noon, and dusk to the rising sun, midday sun and evening glow respectively, as later Zoroastrians do, since sunlight was venerated as the pure light of Ahura Mazda. Major festivals punctuated that year. One key festival was Nowruz, the New Year at the spring equinox, and that's still celebrated in Iran today. Nowruz in Achaemenid times was probably a grand affair. It coincided with spring and symbolized renewal. The king at Persepolis received visitors and tribute from across the empire around this time, as depicted in the famous Apadana reliefs of tribuned bearers. While the Achaemenid inscriptions don't mention Nowruz by name, later tradition ascribes its celebration to them. We can imagine on Nowruz that Persians might clean their homes, light lamps, feast, and perhaps the Magi would recite prayers for the year's prosperity, invoking Asha to prevail in the coming year. Another likely observance was Mithra's festival in autumn, and winter solstice celebrations, what is now Yalda night in Persian custom, by the way. The reverence of natural cycles, seasonal changes, harvest time, and the sun's course, well, they all fit the Zoroastrian view of an orderly cosmos. Children will be taught at a young age the importance of truthfulness. There's a famous quote attributed to a Achaemenid-era education. Persian boys were, quote, taught to ride, shoot the bow, and speak the truth. Herodotus also mentions that the Persians educate their sons from age 5 to 20 in horsemanship, archery, and truth-telling. It reflects the martial society alongside the ethical emphasis. But of course, when Persians died, their relatives would also observe the proper rites to avoid polluting the elements. Likely, as Herodotus noted, the corpse would be exposed, perhaps in a secret place or on a mountaintop, until the flesh was gone, and then the bones were collected and entombed. This practice continued into later times, and it's a distinctly Zoroastrian one. But the Achaemenid Golden Age of Zoroastrianism met a violent destruction in the late 4th century BCE, when Alexander of Macedon overthrew the Persian Empire. Zoroastrian tradition remembers Alexander not as great, but as Alexander the Accursed. Why were they so angry? That's a pretty poor review, isn't it? Because Alexander's conquest had devastating consequences for the Zoroastrian religion. Macedonian troops looted and burned royal palaces, and most tragically, Persepolis was set aflame, according to some Greek sources, because all the Macedonians had just gotten drunk and lost control of themselves. Later Zoroastrian writings accuse Alexander of burning their sacred texts and destroying the fire temples. It is said that the original Avesta manuscripts, which were, by legend, Darius had written on cowhides in gold ink and kept in royal archives, lost in those fires. It is no wonder that they do not call him Alexander the Great. While some of these accounts are likely exaggerated or symbolic, i.e. blaming the foreign conqueror for absolutely every loss, well, there is a bit of truth that the religious infrastructure suffered. Many magi were killed, many temples desecrated, and with the patronage of the Persian kings gone, Zoroastrianism lost its state sponsorship. Under the Seleucid Greeks, who followed, and then the Parthian Empire, another Persian dynasty that later reigned in power from 247 BCE, but it was less centralized. The faith survived, but in a less organized form. Local priesthoods kept the flame alive in villages and families. Oral traditions preserved the hymns and prayers, but there was no single imperial authority enforcing orthodoxy or supporting large temple complexes along the region. Thus, the fall of the Achaemenid Empire marks the end of the first Golden Age. Yet, the religion itself persisted among the people of Iran. For some 5 centuries after Alexander, Zoroastrianism was practiced, all without an empire, a testament on how deeply rooted it was in Iranian culture. But then, in the 3rd century CE, a new Persian empire arose that not only rivaled the Achaemenids in power, but also actively revived Zoroastrianism and took it to new heights. Enter the Sasanian Empire. Alright, so let's talk about the Sasanian Empire. If you're still watching at this point, I bet you click that subscribe button and the like button. It helps me in the algorithm. Now with the begging out of the way, after centuries of Hellenistic and Parthian rule, Iran was reunited by a dynasty that deliberately sought to restore the glory of ancient Persia. The Sasanian Empire, 224 to 651 CE, was founded by the ardent Zoroastrians that made their faith a core pillar of statecraft. If one were to name a true golden age of Zoroastrianism, well, the Sasanian era is probably it. You see, it's a little different from before. Here we see a formalization of the religion, the compilation of sacred texts, a powerful clergy influencing the government, and the faith's expansion and defense amid a changing world of the new religions. Think of Manichaeism, Christianity. All these challenged its supremacy in Persia. So let's dive into this epic with stories of visionary kings and formidable priests of reforms, and also religious zeal that sometimes turned persecution of dissent. This was an age where the sacred fire burned brighter than ever in the royal courts, when the priests wore badges of office and wielded scepters of sacred wood, and when the Zoroastrian worldview influenced everything from the justice system even to the calendar. The story begins with Ardashir I, the founder of the Sasanian dynasty, reigning from 224 to 241. Ardashir was notably the son, or perhaps the grandson, of a Zoroastrian high priest named Sasan. In fact, the name Sasanian comes from Sasan. Legend has it that Sasan was the custodian of a fire temple in the province of Persis, Fars, and Ardashir inherited both royal ambition and devout faith from his lineage. Under the last Parthian king, Artabanus IV, Ardashir was a feudal lord who rose in rebellion. He systematically conquered neighboring regions of Iran, rallying not just his warriors but also magi and zealots who were eager to throw off what they saw as the impious rule of the Parthians. Now, remember, the Parthians, though they were Iranian, were, let's say they were relatively lax in religious manners, and they were more on the Greek side of things. In 224, Ardashir defeated Artabanus in the Battle of Hormozd-Gan and declared himself the Shahan Shah, the King of Kings. And then the Persian Empire was effectively restored, in a true Persian sense. But what is fascinating is how Ardashir immediately set about reviving the old ways as the ideological backbone of his new empire. He is said to have received the divine far, that royal glory in Zoroastrian concept, and justified his rebellion by claiming the support of Ahura Mazda. Think about how in Chinese tradition you have the mandate of heaven. Kind of like that. A Middle Persian document known as the Letter of Tansar Tansar, being a chief priest who supported Ardashir, provides a little insight into this. In this letter, addressed to a local ruler, the priest Tansar explains and justifies Ardashir's reforms, unifying the faith, codifying laws, and purifying the Zoroastrian practice. Although compiled later, it likely echoes the real policies Ardashir undertook. He centralized the Zoroastrian church, elevated a single Mobedan Mobed, that is the chief priest, and worked together the scattered holy texts. Ardashir's efforts are confirmed by later histories too. He made Zoroastrianism the state religion, and he and his priest, Tansar, are credited with collecting the holy texts and finally establishing a unified doctrine. So imagine the scene at Ardashir's court in Ctesiphon, the new capital on the Tigris River. Ardashir invites herbads and dasturs, that's scholarly priests from all provinces. With great ceremony, perhaps in a grand fire temple, they recite from memory the ancient prayers and hymns. Scribes, using a newly developed Avesta alphabet derived from the Aramaic characters, write down these verses for the first time. Now that would have been an enormous undertaking, turning an entirely oral tradition into written scripture. According to tradition, it wasn't fully completed until a later king's reign, but Ardashir began the process. By fixing the canon of the Avesta, the Sasanians ensured the preservation of Zoroaster's teachings beyond the variability of oral transmission. Indeed, many of these texts are written in what we have today as the Zenith Avesta. Ardashir's reign set the tone, that's for sure. Zoroastrian clergy gained prestige and state support, unprecedented since Darius's time. One anecdote indicates that Ardashir's close relationship with the faith. At his investiture, he is depicted in a rock relief, receiving the royal diadem from Ahura Mazda himself, who mirrors the king's stance. In this relief, Ardashir's predecessor lies trampled under the king's horse, and the evil spirit Ahriman lies trampled under Ahura Mazda's horse. That sounds pretty cool, huh? It is a powerful visual metaphor that Ardashir's victory over the Parthians was like a victory over Angra Mainyu, casting the former regime as aligned with darkness and the new aligned with Ahura Mazda. And so, to consolidate his empire, Ardashir was not gentle to dissenters. Some sources say he was less tolerant than the Achaemenids had been. At first, non-Zoroastrians, like certain Manichaean sects or Hindu minorities, faced restrictions. Yet perhaps recalling the old imperial wisdom, Ardashir's son, Shapur I, would relax this, adopting a more stance of inclusion. In any case, by Ardashir's death in 241, Zoroastrianism had become deeply embedded in the imperial structure. From coinage, where kings now commonly had a fire altar depicted, and titles like Mazda worshipper, all the way to administration, the religion was not just a personal matter, it was a matter of state. Shapur I, reigning 241 to 272, inherited a strong empire and took it to new heights, not just militarily, but culturally. He is famous for his conflicts with the Roman Empire, defeating 3 Roman emperors, and he even managed to capture one alive, that being Valerian, which was an unprecedented humiliation for Rome. On his triumphal inscription at Nask-e-Rustam, Shapur calls himself Mazda worshipping, divine Shapur, king of kings of Iran and non-Iran of divine lineage, proudly affirming Ahura Mazda's faith. He also refers to his father as the Mazda-worshipping divinity Ardashir, indicating that Ardashir was deified upon death. Under Shapur I, the Zoroastrian clergy's influence grew further. and no one man exemplifies this more than Kartir, a magus who rose to become the empire's chief priest. In fact, Kartir's own inscriptions survive, and they're pretty damn good. He served not only Shapur I, but also Shapur's successors for several decades, accumulating titles and powers. Kartir recounts how Shapur established many fire altars, called Atash Bahram fires, by the way, across the empire and made the Magi prosperous. As Kartir's authority increased, especially under King Bahram II, he took on the role of a virtual Grand Inquisitor of the faith. In his inscription on the Kabaye Zartosht, a cube-shaped stone structure at Naksh-es-Rutam, Kartir declares, "I made prominent and revered the Mazdayasnian religion, and the heretical and ill-prepared persons who did not follow proper ordinance of the religion, I punished them with corporal punishment and rebuked them. Many who had become unfaithful, I made faithful again. There were many who followed the doctrines of the demons. By my effort they abandoned those doctrines and accepted the teachings of the gods." These words give us a pretty vivid picture. Kartir is basically boasting about quashing the heretics and deviant cults, forcing people back to orthodoxy, now that there was an orthodoxy to be forced back to. And the term heretical men possibly refers to the Manichaeans or other sects, labeled doctrines of the Devas, for any religion not aligned with master worship. Kartir even claims to have established many new fire temples and instituted proper religious services and festivals throughout the empire. One specific target of Zoroastrian ire was the prophet Mani, who during Shapur I's reign founded a new syncretic religion, of course Manichaeism, drawing from Christianity, Buddhism, and Zoroastrian ideas. Shapur, being relatively tolerant and interested in new ideas, had permitted Mani to preach for a while. They even invited him to the court for a debate. However, after Shapur's death, Mani had lost his protector. Under Bahram I, with Kartir's urging, Mani was arrested and brutally executed. In fact, some say that he was flayed alive and his skin stuffed with straw. Manichaeans were labeled heretics, and persecution of them continued. Kartir doesn't mention Mani by name in his inscription, possibly because Mani's execution was widely known, but he does take credit for purifying the land of false teachings. Kartir's extraordinary influence indicates a church-state fusion. He was given governmental powers, judge of the empire, master of ceremonies, things like this. And he even had honorific titles like Kartir, soul saver of King Bahram. Never before had a priest in Iran wielded such temporal authority. This was indeed a golden age for the Magi caste. The status was only second to the king. Zoroastrian doctrine was enforced as law in many respects. One example being Kartir mentioning that he promoted many kin marriages, as referring to the Zoroastrian practice of next of kin marriages. He's effectively saying that he encouraged the faithful to follow even controversial practices strictly, demonstrating zeal for every aspect of the tradition. However, not all Sasanian rulers were as intolerant as Kartir. Shapur himself had a pretty open mind. He even allowed a Greek philosophy school to flourish on Gonda Shapur, and didn't force any conversions at all. After Kartir's heyday, there was a bit of pullback from theocracy. In the late 3rd century, there was even a movement or sect within Zoroastrianism known as Zurvanism, which viewed time, Zurvan, as the primordial god, who gave birth to Ahura Mazda and Ahriman. While the Orthodox Magi, of course, frowned on the Zurvanite doctrine, it showed that there was theological diversity and debate during this golden age. So the everyday practice of Zoroastrianism under the Sasanians began to become more standardized. Fire temples, known as Atash Kadeh, were established in urban centers and holy sites. 3 great fires acquired legendary status as the highest grade fires in the empire, each associated with one of 3 classes of society. The first is Adur Farnbag, the fire of the priests, reportedly located in Pars, that is Persia proper. We have Adur Gushnasp, the fire of the warriors, located in Kazaka in Media, modern-day Azerbaijan. The fire was highly esteemed by Sasanian monarchs, who were of the warrior class, by the way, who would visit there for its blessings and was said to symbolize the empire's military glory. In fact, legends say that Adur Gushnasp had burned since the dawn of time, and that miraculous healings were associated with it. And then there is Adur Burzen Mir, the fire of the farmers or the common folk in Parthia, northeast Iran. Pilgrimage to these great fires was part of a royal ritual. For example, it's recounted that kings would go to Adur Gushnasp after coronations or victories to give thanks. There is one story, perhaps apocryphal but worth telling, of the final Sasanian Emperor, Yazdegerd III's father, visiting Adur Gushnasp and going on foot out of reverence as he approached the sanctuary. Even if legendary, it shows a bit of reverence accorded to these holy sites. Zoroastrian priests in this era were organized in a hierarchy. At the top was the Mobedan Mobed, chief of chiefs of the Magi, kind of like a archbishop. Below him were the Mobeds, district priests, Herbads, learned priests and teachers, and Magi serving at local temples. They maintained the fire rituals meticulously, tending the flame day and night, feeding it with dry wood and frankincense, straining the air as they breathed through a cloth to keep impurities out, and reciting the Avestan prayers for hours a day. The liturgy for each day, month, and year was defined. Yasna, sacrificial liturgy in temples, and seasonal Gahambar festivals to mark the creation's 6 stages throughout the year. The reason why for this is Zoroastrians believed the world was created in 6 steps, each celebrated in a seasonal festival. Kings participated in these festivals as pious Zoroastrians. Sasanian law was heavily influenced by religious doctrine. The courts often deferred to the Dastur, religious jurist, on matters of family law, purity laws, and even criminal punishment. Sin and crime were somewhat blurred. A serious sin like consorting with demons by practicing sorcery, well, that was also a state crime. It was somewhat frowned upon. The Zoroastrian emphasis on cleansing of sin found legal form in fines and penances. Texts like the Vendidad, a section of the Avesta, enumerate purification rituals and penalties for various offenses. These were consulted in Sasanian jurisprudence. If somebody killed an otter, considered a sacred animal in Zoroastrianism, by the way, as it was thought to fight evil creatures in the water, the Vendidad says it's a grievous sin. And if a person's dog died due to their neglect, heavy penance were due. Dogs were sacred animals too. The Sasanian court, guided by priests, would enforce such codes, which to an outsider might seem unusual, especially at the time. But to a Zoroastrian they were essential to maintaining the cosmic and social order. Culturally, the Zoroastrian worldview permeated literature and education. Why did I say it like that? The Sasanian period saw the gathering of ancient legends and epic tales of kings and heroes, many of which carried Zoroastrian moral themes into what was later compiled the Book of Lords, and ultimately distilled in the great epic Shahnameh many centuries later. These stories, like those of Rostam or of the early mythical kings, often illustrate the triumphs of Ashur over the Druze, feature wise sages, often depicted as magi, guiding kings on all sorts of matters. One charming anecdote from the Sasanian period involves King Shapur II in his youth. Now, the story goes that Shapur was actually crowned in utero, as in his father died while his mother was pregnant, so they symbolically crowned the unborn child to thwart court intrigues. But later, as a boy, Shapur was educated by magi. He became devout and earned the nickname Dul Aktaf, he who pierces shoulders. Because of his zeal, he unpunished unruly Arab nomads by pinning their shoulders, a harsh measure attributed to his strictness in defending Iran and its faith. While this anecdote might be colored by later legend, it suggests that by the 4th century, Persian kings were expected to be guardians of not just the realm, but the religion, even from childhood. However, the Sasanian Golden Age was not without its challenges. New rivals in faith emerged, Christianity spread in the western provinces, and many Persians became Christians, which put them in a delicate position whenever Persia fought with the Christian Roman or Byzantine Empire. Some Sasanian kings like Yazdegerd I initially showed tolerance or even friendliness towards Christians, ending him the scorn of magi, who dubbed him Yazdegerd the Sinful for favoring non-Zoroastrians. Later, when the Roman Emperor Constantine declared himself a protector of Christians in Persia, Shapur II reacted by increasing pressure on Persian Christians, fearing they'd be a fifth column for Rome. This led to episodes of persecution of Christians. Many Persian Christian martyrs date to Shapur II's time. Have a read through Fox's Book of Martyrs. He talks a bit about that. Interesting piece of work. So while Zoroastrianism was supreme, it had to jostle with these growing minorities. Unlike under the Achaemenids, now Zoroastrianism had a formalized clergy and scripture, making it perhaps less pluralistic in attitude. The Magi often demanded conformity, but the kings had to balance that with the practical reality of how diverse their subjects were. Too much conformity, well, you might have a rebellion on your hands. One such balancing act actually occurred under Khosrow I in 531-579. Now that is Khosrow I Anushirvan, often regarded as the epitome of a philosopher king in Iran. Khosrow's reign is sometimes called the Second Golden Age of Sasanian culture. He reformed the bureaucracy, promoted scholarship, even welcoming Greek philosophers fleeing Justinian's Christianization of the Eastern Roman Empire, and patronized translations of texts from Greek, Sanskrit, and Syriac into Middle Persian. He is said to have completed the writing down of the Avesta and its extensive Zand commentaries, ensuring that the canon was securely preserved. Khosrow was an orthodox Zoroastrian, but he also enjoyed learned debates. Under him, the Academy of Shapur flourished, blending Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge. I ought to be in a place like that. One can only imagine it. One famous anecdote about Khosrow combines his devotion and ruthlessness. The story of Mazdak. So who was Mazdak? He was a reformer, a preacher, in the late 5th century, under Khosrow's father, Kavad, who taught a radical social creed of communal wealth and even communal marriages, almost like a proto-communist vision grounded in a mix of Zoroastrianism and perhaps even Manichaean ideas. Mazdak argued that eliminating greed and inequality by sharing property and even spouses would eliminate violence, thus helping the cause of good in the cosmic struggle. Now, initially, that won King Kavad's support as a way to curb the aristocracy. But of course, the aristocracy itself and the Magi were frankly horrified by this idea. When Khosrow I took power, he sided with the Orthodox establishment against the the Mazdakites. According to legend, Khosrow invited Mazdak and his followers to a garden, where he had pits dug, and the men were buried alive upside down with only their legs sticking out, before executing Mazdak as well. That's a pretty grisly tale. While perhaps embellished, it symbols how the Sasanians quashed deviations that threatened the social order. Khosrow thereafter reasserted traditional Zoroastrian values and social norms, earning him the epithet Anushirvan the Just. Under Khosrow I, and briefly his grandson Khosrow II in the early 7th century, the Sasanian Empire reached a zenith in territory, prosperity, and cultural output. Zoroastrian symbolism was everywhere. The royal crown bore a winged crescent, possibly representing the Phra-Vahar, or divine glory. Coins showed the ever-burning fire flanked by attendants, and rock reliefs showed kings receiving investiture from Ahura Mazda or attending fire altars. The sense that king and priest were twin pillars of society was never before stronger than this. One might even say their relationship was the king protects the faith, and the priest preserves the king's soul. But of course, when you climb to the top of the mountain, the only way to go is down. By the 7th century, storm clouds had gathered. The long wars with the Eastern Roman Empire weakened both great powers. Meanwhile, in Arabia, a new faith was born, Islam, and the Arab tribes, unified by fervor, swept out in conquest. The fall of the Sasanian Empire to the Arab Muslim armies in the 630s to 50s was swift and dramatic. The last emperor, Yazdegerd III, was unable to rally a fractured nobility. He became a fugitive and was killed in 651, marking the end of 400 years of Sasanian rule. How did it all happen? It couldn't have been that easy, right? Well, in the next part of the video, we're going to discuss the fall of Zoroastrianism, the fall of those empires in which it flourished. Well, for Zoroastrianism, this whole event was even greater than the upheaval of Alexander's conquest. For Islamic rulers over the next century gradually supplanted Zoroastrian institutions. Fire temples were extinguished or converted into mosques. The Magi lost their state support. Many had to flee or go into hiding, or worse. Over time, the majority of Persians adopted Islam, and Zoroastrianism dwindled into a minority faith. Some communities persisted in Iran, especially in the Yazd and Kerman region, and many emigrated to India, forming the Parsi community. The once grand libraries of Avestan literature were largely lost, and only a fraction of texts survived in the priestly memory to be written down later. Thus, the end of the Sasanian Golden Age marks the sunset of Zoroastrian dominance in its homeland. But that is something that we'll talk about next time, because there is certainly a lot to talk about with it. For today, as we extinguish our imaginative duo, we'll conclude by emphasizing a few thoughts. The lessons we've learned, the melding of spiritual values with governance, can certainly elevate a civilization, but it requires wisdom and balance. And if that balance goes out of, well, you know what happened. The story of Zoroastrianism's golden ages is thus both an inspiration, seeing how a powerful moral vision can shape history, and a poignant reminder of the ebb and flow of human fortunes. The flame that once lit those halls of Persepolis, and Ctesiphon, now burns quietly in small temples, but its light is not lost to history. It shines in the ideals of truth and righteousness that remain very much a part of our shared human heritage, and I certainly hope they will remain to do so. Now, I will thank my top-tier patrons and supporters, and I will see you in part 3, of course. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfenir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Video Man, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, and Talbury. Thank you very much. And once again, thank you all for joining me. And I will see you in part 3, or whatever other video you want to watch. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.